Now, on the other end of the spectrum are those doctrinal discussions that include extensive explanations. Very often, these more elaborate explanations also present extensive evidences for theological viewpoints, arguing for this or that point of view. For the most part, formal writings in systematic theology fall into this category. Thoroughgoing systematic theologies often incorporate everything found in creeds, catechisms, and confessions, and then add volumes of explanatory material. For instance, whereas the Apostles' Creed devotes only a few lines to the doctrine of Trinity, and the Heidelberg Catechism devotes 31 questions and answers to it, Charles Hodge, in his Systematic Theology, dedicates 4 chapters to the doctrine, and these chapters span over 200 pages. Extensive explanations of doctrines are characteristic of formal systematic theologies. So, as we approach the subject of doctrines in systematic theology, we need to realize that we're dealing with various levels of explanation. Doctrines explain biblical teachings on theological topics to different degrees. Now that we've seen what we mean when we speak of doctrines in systematic theology, we should turn to the second concern of our orientation to this topic. How can we justify creating doctrines? Why do theologians think it's legitimate to synthesize and explain biblical teachings in these ways? These are important questions because so many Christian churches resist affirming doctrines. Maybe you've heard the slogans, "No creed but Christ." "We want no doctrine but the Bible." Now, we can appreciate the motives behind these sentiments because they usually reflect a very high view of Scripture. So why can't systematic theologians just leave the teachings of the Bible as they are? Why do they divide the teachings of Scripture into topics and synthesize and explain what the Scriptures say about those topics? One of the most compelling cases in favor of creating doctrines is that biblical figures model this practice for us. We'll touch on just 2 examples of biblical figures discussing doctrines. First, we'll look at the example of Jesus, and second, at the example of the Apostle Paul. Let's look first at a time when Jesus gave us a topical synthesis and explanation of biblical teachings. For example, consider the time when Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment. Listen to these words from Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 through 40. One of the Pharisees, an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." As we will see, what Jesus did here has all the elements of our definition of a theological doctrine. First, this passage focuses on a theological topic. A Pharisee approached Jesus with a question: "Lord, what is the greatest commandment?" This question rose out of the ways theologians in Jesus' day had mapped their theological concerns. There is no Old Testament book, chapter, paragraph, or even a verse that directly addresses this question. So, in effect, the Pharisee raised a theological topic that was very similar to the kinds of topics we find in systematic theology. Second, Jesus responded by synthesizing 2 biblical passages. He did not simply quote a single biblical passage and leave it at that. Instead, he brought together 2 verses from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, and Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. On the one hand, he quoted Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, when he said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." And he quoted Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, when he said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Like systematic theologians, Jesus synthesized various biblical passages into a doctrinal discussion about the greatest commandment. Third, Jesus gave an explanation of his viewpoints on this topic. He explained the priorities of these commandments when he said, "This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it." And finally, Jesus explained the importance of the commands with his closing theological comment, "All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments."